What is economic vision and why do we need it? Find out in this episode of PEP Talk.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Hello, and welcome to PEP Talk, the show that explains and talks about a participatory economy, a democratic alternative to capitalism. I'm your host, Mitchell Szczepanczyk, coming to you from Chicago. And today, our topic is vision. What is it? Do we need it? What does that mean? Joining us from Portland, Oregon in the United States is Robin Hahnel, one of the co-founders of the model of participatory economics, professor, writer, author. We're also joined from London, England by Jason Chrysostomo, who is a longtime political activist, writer, and contributor to the Participatory Economy website. And joining us from Helsinki, Finland is Antti Jauhiainen, a longtime writer, activist as well, also involved with the participatory economic model. We'll start the show by having a go around where we'll take turns to answer the main question about vision. What is it? Do we need it? Robin, let's start with you. So what does it mean to have vision, I guess, regarding political economy, and do we need it?
People are increasingly upset, angry, dissatisfied with the way their economies are functioning. And people become engaged in various battles to reform neoliberal capitalism. But at this point, the question inevitably arises, well, if you don't want this, then what is it you want instead? And that's a question that I think that is important to try and provide an answer to. There was a point in the 20th century where the anti-capitalist movements believed they had an answer, that the answer was the answer that Marx had originally outlined or suggested in earlier sort of pre-Marxist socialists. They thought the answer was obvious. Then there was another time period when a lot of socialists thought, well, the answer is being worked out in the Soviet Union, or later in Maoist China or someplace else, or in Yugoslavia. But that's sort of history that has now sort of flown under the bridges. And I think most people realize, well, those weren't the answers. A, the answer wasn't as simple as early socialists thought it was. And B, various real-world attempts to replace a capitalist economy with something different also didn't turn out to be what it is we want. And so that leaves us with a situation where this is an important subject. It's not that people don't have to spend most of their time engaging in various struggles to try and mitigate the damage from neoliberal capitalism and prevent climate change before it's too late. But still, increasingly, particularly younger generations, I believe, are dissatisfied with capitalism, but they want to know an answer to, well, do we have any coherent ideas that learn from the failures of the past about what it is that we should be thinking about as a vision for our economies in the future? So I think that's the importance. And I also think it's something that sustains activism, that if you have a clear idea of what it is you want instead, I think it makes it easier and more powerful to fight against the system that is damaging all of us and the planet. And I think that's the reason that some sort of vision and coherent thinking about vision is very important. And the model of a participatory economy was created in an attempt to sort of answer that question and become part of a debate, an active debate amongst those who are dissatisfied with capitalism about, well, can we do better and how would we do better?
Antti, let's turn the floor over to you. What is it meant to have vision, and do we need it?
Well, Robin had a very good answer to that, and I'd like to sort of follow on that with some Nordic examples, because I really think that the Nordic countries are a good example on why we need a vision and what happens when you don't have one. I think throughout the 20th century, Nordic countries had this huge sort of progress that we made. Of course, I'm from Finland, so I like to say especially Finland did that because we were poorest of these countries. Finland was really one of the poorest countries in Europe just 100 years ago or so, or in the late 19th century, early 20th century, a bit like Russia. Through that, we managed to become a really successful welfare state and achieved in a short time during 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s commendable achievements toward much more democratic society and much more equitable society. But unfortunately, I think those social democrats working at that time to create a welfare state, a better economy, well, I think firstly, they were right about being very skeptical about communism. They knew that vision, I think from very early on, that vision was not one it's not a credible solution to the ills of capitalism. So they sort of started chasing power in the hopes of building a credible alternative to capitalism and an actual society, democratic society, also regarding the economy. A lot of social democratic writers from the first half of 20th century in Finland write about this, that they actually want a democratic economy. But unfortunately, through that progress, I think they became a bit like the Joker says in the movie Dark Knight, that he's like he's like a dog chasing cars. If he managed to have the car, he wouldn't know what to do with it. And I think the Social Democrats actually, they grasped into power. They had the keys to build an alternative to capitalism, a very advanced alternative to capitalism, and they just didn't know what to do with it. And the capital and capitalists were ready to roll back any progress made and were, very focused on protecting their gains and stopping the advances of this early vision for a post-capitalist society and democratic economy. And the Social Democrats simply weren't prepared for that. And that's where I think vision comes in, that you really can't be too ambiguous about it. I sort of personally hope that the one thing the 21st century progressives will agree on is that we seriously have to do something permanently about capitalism. I think agreement on that in the face of the climate crisis is a possibility, that we will agree that capitalism has to go in some form over some period of time. But I think more and more important it would be to start discussing about vision, about credible, utopia, about credible alternatives on how to actually run the economy in a democratic way. And I actually think that that's pretty crucial right now, because climate change is still progressing faster than we anticipated. I think we will be forced to do something serious about capitalism in medium term. And now would be a very good time to still have a sort of recent debate, recent discussion about how to run future far off democratic economy whilst we try to mitigate and solve the climate crisis with the tools available right now, namely, of course, partly capitalism and firstly, state-managed solutions. So that's why I think Nordic countries especially are a good vantage point for talking about vision for post-capitalism.
Jason, let's turn it to you. What is your response? So what's it meant to have vision, and do we need it?
I agree with Robin. I think the most important reason to develop vision is to combat this debilitating belief that there is no alternative to capitalism. And I mean, I live in the UK, and of course, it was Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s who coined the term TINA, there is no alternative. And when you talk to people, I mean, and opinion polls show that there is widespread distrust of corporations. People know that they are out there just to benefit their shareholders. But the alternative that's always only thought of is the idea of the Soviet Union, central planning, and that binary kind of choice. So that's something that we desperately need to challenge. And another point to say is that when there are situations where the majority of the population rises up to have a revolution and overthrows existing power system, one of the problems of not having a shared vision is of what you want to put in the place of that system or power. If it's not there, then often someone else steps in. Perhaps some examples could be the Arab Spring in Egypt. Maybe there are better examples, but what really has changed systemically? You're just replacing one person with another. And then I suppose finally is how important having vision is to inform strategic choices today as well. So I think one of the big weaknesses of the left is not having a long-term strategy. Everything is very short-term, very reactive. And to have a long-term strategy, you do also need to think about, vision needs to be there. Even though it's not clearly, specifically defined, having some kind of concrete, credible answer of, what it is what kind of society it is you're striving for is important. People have legitimate kind of concerns and questions about, how does this new system work? And we need more than just rhetorical kind of vague answers to those questions. Like, we need a more democratic and fairer society. Okay, but how is that actually going to work? So I think it's an important discussion to have as we kind of build new institutions, as we develop new experiments. For example, building worker cooperatives, participatory budgeting experiments, things like that are all part of a longer term vision and kind of a route to a new system. And so Mitchell, how about you?
How about me? By vision, I refer to that as basically an answer to the question, what do you want? The main issue with that is sometimes people will be able to articulate that, but not necessarily to a full extent. There are a couple of examples I can bring to mind. One, actually, we're now just past the 10th anniversary of that, Occupy Wall Street, which was founded by the magazine out of Vancouver, Canada, Adbusters. Adbusters has done and actually continues to do lots of various campaigns on various things with trying to provide an answer to some of that question, what do you want? Some of these are actually quite good and actually kind of mesh with the model of a participatory economy that a number of us have advocated for. Like, for example, Adbusters has advocated for a kind of a fair pricing model so that prices for various goods better reflect the environmental impacts, which is great and a thing to fight for, and which Adbusters has advocated for. But if it's not done in tandem with, like, say, an allocation system that doesn't involve markets, well, then you're still beholden to market forces, as they're called. Nor if people can't necessarily contribute to how those prices might be determined, that may fall moot and might not be terribly reactive. So providing an answer to what you want can sometimes be incomplete, which is why it's important to focus on that and also to share similar visions. There's another example that actually comes to mind, which took place in Chicago. This was in 2008, where there actually was something of a worker revolt at a window factory in Chicago, Republic Windows and Doors. This actually got a fair amount of attention, certainly in the United States, maybe elsewhere, where workers in the window factory in Chicago, near downtown on a location known as Goose Island, actually revolted to take over their own factory. And they actually got a fair amount of local support and certainly a lot of attention for doing this. But the problem, and they were able to actually win some gains, but the problem was that was not done in concert with some kind of broader view where you have one group that's able to successfully win one revolt, but those gains could be reversed. The efforts might be small scale. They could be held up as an example that could be crushed. So unless that's done in concert with some larger thing, while it can be held up as a successful example and people will analyze it and write books about it. I have a friend who actually did write a book about it. It might not lead to anything larger, and nothing as a result really changes after that. So people can articulate what they want, but unless it's done with concert with a larger context of that wouldn't go very well. And then one reason why I'm actually kind of like the model of a participatory economy is that it tries to articulate that full vision, not just a pricing model or a better pricing model or a model where workers have better control over their work circumstances, but the entirety of things. More worker control, and actually also consumer control on their respective circumstances, prices, an allocation system that doesn't involve either command planning or markets, and a fairer way to allocate different tasks among people in the complex of balanced jobs. So that would be my answer to that.
Additionally, I sort of like to add that having a vision also forces people who wish to see a democratic economy to firstly sort of admit that this change will not come fast. This will be a really long process that will actually take, at least decades, and also require significant amounts of seriously hard work to provide answers to the people who are disillusioned of capitalism and suffering under capitalism, to provide them with concrete answers, both on sort of in a broader visionary sense, but also in very concrete terms of thinking how will, housing work, how we will manage our apartments and houses, how will, railways work, stuff like this. That's not in detail, but in general context, so that we have answers for people on how will things actually change under non-capitalism. And a lot of those answers may not be that sort of easy or simple, or even, some of them might not be that, pleasant, that they are actually sort of murky things to think about. But I think that discussion is still required. It's just, unfortunately, we've gotten ourselves into a really bad situation with capitalism, and digging out of this hole will require time and work, and admitting that is very important. But also vision will help us sort of concretize. What's the word in English? Make concrete.
Concretize will do it.
Concretize, yeah. Why it's worth fighting for, because that way you can see how all the bad stuff happening now could work so much more better, and how sort of how big of a waste it is to do things as they're currently done.
Let me try and say two things to sort of just hone in on vision and the role that I think it needs to play at this point in time. The left has a credibility problem. There are plenty of people out there who are unhappy with the way things are going with the economies right now. But when they look at the left, they have good reason to ask themselves, why should we follow these people? Now, if you go back to 1900 or prior to 1917, I think it was reasonable for people to say, look, there are people fighting against capitalism. There are people who are saying there's a better system, and not to require something more concrete than sort of, we want an economy that satisfies these values. We want an economy that's a democratic economy. We want an economy that's a fair economy. So if you go back to 1900, it was possible for a left, an anti-capitalist left, a pro-new system left, to be compelling, but that's not the situation we're in the beginning of the in the 21st century at this point. That we have a whole century in which the left and various attempts to replace capitalism have not worked out. So it's very reasonable at this point in time for people to ask themselves, has the left got itself any more together than it was in the past? And the other thing that we need to recognize is that, particularly since the fall of the wall in Berlin and sort of the universal recognition that the historic answers, alternatives to capitalism, were not anything, that we want to propose or champion for the future. There really is the discussion on the left of what it is that we want to replace capitalism with is one where there is no consensus at this point in time, that there are all sorts of different ideas and proposals out there. So we lack credibility. And in the past 20 years, the various answers we have come up with There is no real consensus around them. So that's the situation we find ourselves in. And my own reaction to that is there's a desperate need to improve the quality of debate about concretely, not in sort of moving beyond rhetoric and descriptions of what kind of economy we would wish for. There's a critical need at this point in time for far more concrete answers to what it is that, and one last thing I would say, it's simply a question of sort of, there's a question of logic, which is how can you develop a strategy unless you know two things? You have to have a very clear idea of what's the situation you are in at the beginning. You have to have a clear analysis of sort of various forces and the strengths of various forces in the situation you're in the present. But strategy also requires having some idea of where you're trying to get to. And without a clear idea of where we're trying to get to, purely from sort of a logical point of view, it's hard to imagine how you can do good strategic thinking. So good strategic thinking requires two things: a very accurate assessment of where you are and a fairly clear idea of where it is you're trying to get to. And vision and the model of a participatory economy is an answer to that last part of what is needed to come up with sensible strategy over the next decades.
I have to add, because I have a favorite TV show. Shout out to all Babylon 5 fans out there. Wow. And that's absolutely my favorite TV show. And it revolves around three questions, basically. It's who are you, what do you want, and where are you going? And I think vision, even in this sort of sense of democratic planning, democratic economy, provides answers to all three of those. And this provides me an opportunity to promote a wonderful TV show. So that's something that sort of just came up to me right now, and it's a wonderful thought.
Yeah, I know of an activist who actually works with the website Truth Out, who also lives in Chicago, Kelly Hayes, who writes some very militant things regarding the police and labor activism, but will also start commenting about Star Trek Deep Space Nine, for example. So she'll actually, it's like bring in people who are looking at Star Trek, but they're also, you can read about what bad things the police are doing these days. So
yeah, but it's also problematic because Star Trek isn't as good as Babylon 5. So,
well, I haven't seen Babylon 5, so I'll have to watch it and then I'll get back to you on that.
What do people think about the argument against developing post-capitalist vision on the grounds that, well, we don't know about the future, we have to let the future citizens to decide, and it just leads to sectarianism?
That's a very interesting point that you raise. In fact, this is actually, I've had conversations with people who would align themselves as Marxists and people who would align themselves as libertarians, people who are politically very different from one another and would have almost nothing in common, nonetheless agree on this point that, we'll just wait after we win until we decide. The main objection I have to that is you're not going to win unless you answer that question first. And another reason why I think a project like the Participatory Economy Project is very important, because it actually tries to answer that question: what do you want and how do you work and how would you get there? Which none of those projects actually ever get off the ground or go anywhere, for that matter.
Yeah, I think one of the main reasons that they haven't been successful, and why it's also a good thing that they haven't been successful, is exactly because they are avoiding answering those questions. And I think actual solution, it's just sort of a pragmatic thing that you really can't build a post-capitalist economy and post-capitalist democratic society without answering the kind of questions, for example, we in the PEP Talk try to address. And I think it's a very important discussion that needs more participants. And those people who are avoiding it, what can I say? They're free to avoid it, but I think we are starting to have over, decades or actually century of avoiding answering those, that it's something that we desperately need. It's a discussion that we need to have. Of course, we don't have, solutions to everything right now, but I think we should start sort of aiming a bit higher on getting those answers.
Science and Society is, I believe it's the oldest journal that has continuously published that is explicitly anti-capitalist and pro-socialist. So it's been around for a long time. And after the fall of the wall, there was the editor of that journal, the managing editor, proposed that the journal should have a special issue discussing sort of different visions for alternatives to capitalism. And there was a huge argument amongst the collective. And the majority opinion amongst the collective was that, no, we should not, devote an issue of the journal to talking about different models of socialism, different alternatives to capitalism. They called this building castles in the air. And instead, leftists should simply devote themselves to the struggles on the ground, and that when our successful struggles against capitalism bore fruit, at that point, it would become apparent to people, what to build and what to put in its place. And David Laibman, who was the managing editor, was in disagreement with that. And I think only through force of will did he manage to, convince Science and Society we should have an issue where we discuss different alternatives, that this is important. This is not something that should be left to later. It just can't be left to later anymore. And to his credit, Science and Society now, every decade since 1991, and every single time it's been a struggle, are we going to have a new issue, 10 years later, in which we invite people who have written and worked in this area, to talk about their alternatives to capitalism. And the fourth issue will come out next year. But this is certainly a sentiment that many on the left have expressed, even in light of all of our failures, even after acknowledging that people have very different answers to this question on the left about what is it that we should be fighting for and what should our vision be. Even in that context, all these years, there's just many, many people out there who would like to avoid the issue, who essentially come up with some excuse or another for avoiding the issue. But I just don't think it works. It just isn't compelling anymore.
Why do you think that they avoid the issue? Maybe they're just afraid to get into an
my own
argument with friends.
That's interesting. My own sense is that those amongst us who self-identify very strongly as Marxists, I think part of where this comes from is that Marx kind of had that attitude. I mean, Marxists discuss what did Marx actually write about socialism, and Marx was rather vague. Now, my own reading of Marx is he's not nearly as vague as some market socialists would have us believe, because he clearly did not envision a market system as what he had in mind, since his analysis was, no, the market system is such a huge part of the problem. But in any case, I think that there is a tradition amongst Marxists to argue, there's something about Marxism that says we don't really need to do this kind of thinking. And Marx himself, but Marx was writing in the 19th century. Marx was writing in an environment where all the anti-capitalists and socialists did not think it was going to be that difficult to figure out for the associated producers to figure out how to run their economy for themselves and coordinate their various efforts after they got the yoke of capitalism lifted from their necks. I mean, Marx was not alone in having that sort of attitude about how it is that history was going to unfold.
That's can-do attitude.
That's right. Get rid of our oppressors and just watch how well we can do. Yeah. When you think of it that way, it was not unreasonable. I mean, I'm sure that if I had lived in that period, I would have had that attitude also. But we have 100 years of history, that has come since then, that suggests that maybe that's a little over optimistic.
Additionally, I think we've learned of the price that, managing an actual, by now, a global economy is actually very sort of responsible stuff. And it has to be thought out very well. And that can-do attitude is also one of the reasons that we've gotten into climate crisis, is that we haven't heard from people. We haven't listened to people who have said for decades now that actually, I think we should start planning our economy a bit more carefully.
I could also say that as somebody who's worked on this, I've been working on the answer to this question, that's worthy of debate for going on 40, 50 years now. And it really is only in the last 7 or 8 years that I realized at this point that there were a whole bunch of questions, even when I began this project 40 years ago, and said, look, somebody has to figure out, is it really possible to have a system that's not central planning and that's not markets? Can we really have a kind of planning that isn't a market system and isn't a centrally planned system? And we worked on that, and I was pretty happy with the result. But, very honestly, that was not an answer to how do you do long-term development planning. That was an answer to how can you do things without centrally planning what everybody's going to do for the year and without letting markets decide what everybody's going to do for the year. That's not an answer to how do you do long-term development planning, environmental planning, strategic international economic planning, investment planning. So I was naively optimistic as a leftist about, do we really have answers to all the questions we're going to need answers to? And I think one of the things that's happened in the sort of evolution of the sort of thinking about a participatory economy is it's evolved also. And there were a whole bunch of issues and questions that we were just sort of naive. We gave the same naive answers to, about, well, we want development planning to be democratic. That's not an answer to how to do it. And we want, we understand that a desirable economy that, if a country adopts a desirable economy, it's still going to have to trade and deal with international investment, and it's going to have to deal with the fact that there's huge differences of level of economic development between countries. How do you participate in a global economy in that way? We didn't have answers to that, and it's been sort of an evolutionary process for us to come up with, in the same sense that we always have. Here are concrete suggestions. Here are questions that have to have answers. And here are the problems with some answers, and here are some better answers. Can we talk about it? That's all part of concrete thinking about what problems will be faced and what are the various possibilities, their pros and cons. And I think having quality debate about those things is part of, I think it's necessary it's necessary to convince activists that, unlike in times past, anti-capitalists actually have answers to the problems that will arise that are far better, than anybody has had before.
I think the quality of the debate point is the important one to stress here. Do we need to, is this an important activity that we all engage in? Yes, it is. But the question is how we do it. And the left has been awful at being able to, in a constructive, healthy way, talk about. Of course, people are going to have different ideas about what the alternative is, but it's how we talk about it. And very often it descends into very rigid dogma, kind of defensive positions. And that's, I think, the problem that we need to really overcome. And I think we're doing a kind of a good job here when we talk about the participatory economy model, not to kind of fall back into ideology as much as best we can, and to have a very open, constructive debate and discussion with other people who also have proposals for how to organize the economy differently.
That's actually very refreshing to say, Jason, that another great thing about this model that I really like is it's testable. If it turns out that it doesn't work, you can test it and see that it doesn't work and know, okay, this doesn't work. Let's figure out something else. But if it does, well, okay, great. Maybe we should go with that. Or it's mostly works, but there are other things we need to change about it or other things we need to address. Let's see if we can build off of that. That it's not just you're just simply arguing pointlessly forever. You're trying to find an answer and to actually show with empirical evidence of some form or another that it can work. I'm fortunate that I was actually able, working with Robin as well as with a student at Portland State, Michael Weisdorf, in building out a computational model where we got to answer some of these questions.
There's I think, Jason, your point that quality of debate is what matters. If we had consensus, we would be, if we already had a consensus about vision, we'd be in a very different place. But we do not have consensus. There's a lot of difference of opinion. You have people who say we don't even want to address the issue. Then you have anybody who wants to address the issue, well, they don't necessarily come to the same conclusion. Well, an excellent example is Eric Olin Wright and I have we've both thought a lot about this. And Eric Olin Wright, basically his vision that he championed was what I thought one of the better versions of market socialism. Whereas I've been a proponent of planning rather than a market system as the alternative to capitalism. And we began an email exchange between us. And sometimes what happens in a debate or a discussion is it gets very sectarian very, very quickly. And it's amazing how people can't actually hear what the other person is saying and sort of provide a criticism of something that wasn't even what the other person was suggesting. And Eric and I sort of began that process. And what we discovered was that if we listened to one another, we found a lot more common ground than either one of us expected to find when we began. And what began is just sort of an exchange between somebody who was in favor of, I think I'm in favor of market socialism as the vision that the left should be proposing, and me saying, no, I don't think. I think we want something more along the lines of sort of councils that plan together. That turned into a book that was a dialogue between the two of us, which was, I still hold that out as the example of the kind of improvement of the quality of debate and discussion that is desperately needed, and all too often is not what takes place.
That book, for folks who are interested, is called Alternatives to Capitalism, co-written by the late Eric Olin Wright and by Robin Hahnel. We'll wrap it up here. This has been the Participatory Economy Podcast, PEP Talk. We've been talking about vision. What is it? Do we need it? Why is it important? You can find out more about the model of a participatory economy online at the Participatory Economy website, participatory-economy.org. There you can join in the forum to discuss and debate, ask questions about this, and also sign up to our monthly newsletter at the participatory-economy.org website. We'll wrap it up here from Helsinki, Finland, London, England, and Portland, Oregon, as well as Chicago. I'm Mitchell Szczepanczyk. On behalf of PEP Talk, thank you for joining us. We'll see you another time. Goodbye.
Could you please tell us what you see as the alternative?
Self-management, democratic control of communities or workplaces, federal arrangement.
Participatory democratic planning.
Jobs to have a mix of empowered your vested councils linked to one another. Everyone gets to participate in a primary council.
Please visit participatory-economy.org to find out more and subscribe to our newsletter. And don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks, and see you at the next episode.